going? All right. To talk about what surely will be your hit book, The Sisterhood, The Secret History of the Women in CIA, we welcome our guest. She's an award-winning journalist, a New York Times best-selling author of 4 books, including Code Girls, which we have behind the counter as well. She's a former staff writer for the Washington Post. Liza currently writes for The Atlantic, Politico, and Smithsonian Magazine, amongst many other publications. Please welcome Liza Mundy. Welcome to Santa Barbara.
Thank you so much. As you know, I've been here quite a few times,
Yes.
spending some productive interview hours. And
Yeah.
but I wanted to thank you so much for this incredible bookstore. Authors love independent bookstores. This is a wonderful gold standard independent bookstore, and thank you for creating a space where authors can come and meet readers. And thank you all for being here and for patronizing this fantastic store and for standing. I just love that there are so many books that it's sort of a standing room only bookstore.
It is. And often, people have to dodge the books every so often. So, this is a wonderful book. I want to know how you got the idea to write this book.
So it did grow out of my last book, Code Girls, which tells the story of more than 10,000 women who came to Washington, D.C. during World War II, after we're terribly surprised at Pearl Harbor, which is the event that launches us, the United States, into World War II and exposes our total lack of intelligence gathering capability. We have 18 intelligence agencies in Washington, D.C. now with the Space, it used to be 17. I used to be able to say 17 in talks, and then the Space Force became the 18th. And when we were surprised at Pearl Harbor, we had zero. We had to build from the ground up at the very moment when all of the young men are signing up for the fighting. And so this light bulb moment literally goes on in the head of Washington officials. News source, women's colleges, women who want to sign up. And so Code Girls is about the women recruited, many of them from my neck of the woods, Roanoke, Virginia, southwestern Virginia, school teachers who came to Washington and learned how to break codes. And I knew when I was researching that book that there was a parallel cohort of women who were recruited into the fledgling espionage service. Our first civilian spy service that we'd ever had was created, the Office of Strategic Services, during World War II. The British had a similar operation, parachuted women into occupied France. And so I was always interested in that cohort as well. And in addition, very interested in what happened after the war, when the attempt was made to stuff the genie back into the bottle, send the women home. Thanks very much, ladies. But it didn't completely succeed. And the lives of women in service during the Cold War, this extremely conventional time, when the stereotype is that women are mothers and housewives, but there is this cohort of really dedicated women serving the intelligence community, making considerable personal sacrifices because they're not leading stereotypical lives. So I was just interested always in the contrast of that period.
Interesting. I know that OSS was the first organization to deal with covert operations, especially with women in it. But however, before that, there were individuals such as Harriet Tubman, you mentioned, and what is the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a private detection agency. 1/3 of them were women.
There was a whole women's detective unit. The Pinkerton was the sort of forerunner of the Secret Service. They did all sorts of detective work, but Kate Warren was the head of Pinkerton's female division, and she came to Pinkerton one day and she said, basically, you need me. She said, just by dint of being a woman, I'm undercover. I'm nondescript. Nobody notices me. They think I'm a laundress. I can go anywhere. I can go to bars. I can go to restaurants. I can move about the streets undetected, and nobody's going to think that I'm surveilling them or that I'm spying. And she ended up smuggling Abraham Lincoln to Washington, D.C. There was a plot to assassinate him before even his first inauguration. So she posed as the caregiving sister of a tall, bearded invalid, and he was brought on the train to Washington, D.C. And Harriet Tubman is her skills of what we would call now exfiltration, exfiltrating enslaved Americans from the South to the North. And that's something that women did during World War II as well. In occupied Europe, occupied France, an American woman named Virginia Hall was in Lyon, France, and then other parts of France. So when airmen would be shot down, she had a network of French women who at great personal risk would pose as their girlfriends, would teach them how to convincingly present themselves as French, and smuggle them out of the countries. But Harriet Tubman was doing that, 100 years before, and so she is recognized now for her spy work, as basically a spy mistress. And I've read descriptions of how she could. I read one time there's a scene of her like sitting with her grandchildren, and she could just sort of like slip onto the ground, like just sort of vanish, like trickle away. And again, she proves that the person that you would least expect to be doing this kind of work is the person often who can do it most effectively.
Which is, we'll expand on that in a little bit, but there's also another semi-historical figure that used to live here, who I had no idea she was an OSS operative. And who was that? Who was that?
Her maiden name was Julia McWilliams. She grew up in Pasadena. She was a graduate of Smith College. Like many female college graduates, of whom there were not many, and only 4% of American women in 1942 had completed a college degree because there were so few jobs available for women. And so Julia McWilliams was kind of bouncing around after she graduated from Smith. She didn't have to work. She came from an affluent family, but she wasn't ready to get married, and looking for something to do with her talents. And then when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor and entered the war, she tried to enlist in the Navy Waves when the Waves were created, and she was too tall to qualify as a Wave, and so she was recruited into the Office of Strategic Services. She was the secretary at first. The women were always started as secretaries and assessed on their ability to file and also their ability to put up with being underutilized, to have their gifts and talents not recognized or tapped to their full extent, at least at first. And but war is an accelerant. Many of the women for the OSS very quickly moved up in the hierarchy, including Julia McWilliams, who found herself on a boat to China, and then a lot of scary airplane rides in China, in which she was apparently very jolly and unafraid. She met and started dating a State Department mapmaker named Paul Child, and then after the war, after they got married, we know her as Julia Child. Yeah.
And apparently her first exposure to cooking was making some kind of shark repellent.
Yeah,
Is that a myth?
So
Or-
the CIA historians, I hate to say, cast sort of cold water on that
Oh, do
idea
they?
about
Okay,
the shark
okay.
repellent. So it's not, but it has the flavor of one of those anecdotes that's too good to check. As journalists sometimes say. So
It's a nice myth,
it
though.
is a nice myth. It's a nice myth. And there's a photo of her in the book. I mean, there's some wonderful photos of her during her OSS days. And we selected a particularly, I think that there's a photo in the book that I think is probably a Julia Child who you haven't seen before, in a kind of a moody, seemingly clandestine kind of pose that I thought was really interesting.
Longtime residents know that you could see her around town. Like she would sit with us at coffee and talk, or you'd see her at McDonald's of all places.
And her OSS service, it was part of her life story that she wouldn't have met Paul Child. She wouldn't have gone to Marseille. Wow. She wouldn't have gone. She went to France with him because he made a career in the State Department, and she would not have followed him. She would not have had that epiphany moment where she had, you know, whatever the meal was, when she realized, oh wow, this is what good food can taste like, and decided to, you know, devote her life to learning how to cook that cuisine. So, you know, none of it would have happened.
I bring this up, Julia Child, up not because of local connect, just because of that, but because I think you did mention in an interview not long ago that she was kind of a little bit of an influence for you to write this book.
Yeah, I've always, I mean, I like any home cook, I worship at the shrine of Julia Child, and I've always been interested in that aspect of her biography. And, you know, she was a bit of a late bloomer in finding her career, and it was certainly a circuitous route. Nothing in life prepared her for that, but yeah.
Interesting. And this book is so expansive. It starts from the OSS all the way through, you know, Osama bin Laden, and even today. I was wondering, it's such a wide scope of book. How were you able to do all this kind of research, and how many people did you talk to interview?
Yeah, it did become a quite densely populated book, but I do hope it feels like a story, because to me it was it's almost like an intergenerational saga, and but there is a storyline, I feel, and that the women who were recruited in World War II and often put in archiving and filing positions, at least at first, the archival skills that they developed and the ability to keep track of people and to construct biographies and to keep track of adversaries throughout the world, both after the war when hunting Nazis and trying to track them down through the and building these incredible files back at the CIA. One of the things you don't really, when you think of spy work, you think of this work out on the streets, collecting secrets, but all of that goes back to headquarters, and it all has to be archived and kept track of, all this top secret classified information. So after 9/11 in 2008, 2009, 2010, hunting Osama bin Laden, these same skills of using data sets, of understanding who communicates with whom, knowing the biographies of individuals and being able to find them where they're hiding in the world, just as they did with Nazis trying to escape after the war. I think there's a storyline that both a thread of the kind of work that women were originally pigeonholed into, and that ultimately became very important to the CIA's mission, and I think the way in which the women over years built a network, built a sisterhood, in which one generation of women was helping the next generation. So
they were all shuttled into what they call a reports officer, correct?
Right. So they would be various kinds of desk jobs. Oh, but in answer to your question about how I did the research, you know, a lot of it took place during the pandemic.
Okay.
And I was fortunate in that many of the women that I interviewed, particularly women who worked as CIA officers, they don't call themselves spies, but I permit myself to call them spies on the street, are risk-taking people who were willing to have distanced interviews during the pandemic, and also very accustomed to outdoor sort of walk and talk type conversations. I mean, that's like how they do their job anyway. So it wasn't that much of a stretch to have, in some cases, literally walk and talk outdoor distance conversations at the beginning of the pandemic, or on patios, or in secluded my backyard garden. Whereas, as I said, I was very flattered when one of the women I interviewed said, you know, this is a very good clandestine spot. Multiple forms of egress, you can enter one way and exit the other way. And I called her and I was like, I have a clandestine spot.
So when you go to restaurants, you start looking at exits and
they do, yeah.
Do you though?
I do. No, I still don't. I should.
But there's, on the other hand of reports officers, there's the desirable position that, you know, at the very beginning alluded most, if not all, women call it a case officer, which is aka the spy. If you could still talk a little bit about case officers and what they did.
Right, and it sounds like that sort of sounds like sort of a bland term, but that really is the formal term for what we think of as a spy. And these are the fighter pilots of the CIA. I mean, the CIA has tens of thousands of employees, and this is a fairly small cadre of very elite individuals who are selected for all sorts of qualities of temperament, risk-taking, logistical skills, charismatic personality, the ability to spot, recruit, and handle foreign nationals, to persuade a resident of another country to break the law of their country by handing over secrets that their government's trying to keep from the United States that the United States wants. Sometimes it's documents, sometimes it's technology, but they're essentially people who are capable of asking someone, a foreign national, to put their own life at risk, their own well-being and livelihood and freedom at risk. I mean, because if the person gets caught in their country, any number of things could happen to them. It's just very dangerous work, and it involves taking care of that person who has entrusted themselves to you and to the U.S. government, and that, I would argue, is taking care of people. Is a quality that women may or may not be better at, but they certainly have tens of thousands of years of specialized training.
I'm paraphrasing here, but I love what you said about case officers. The case officer's job was to convince their potential assets to commit treason.
Yeah.
Country. Essentially, that's what they did, which is not to be confused with, we have a gentleman from the FBI here. CIA operatives were not law enforcement officers.
Right.
How would you describe what a CIA case officer, how would you describe them as far as what their role is?
Well, within the CIA, they say, the FBI are the cops and we're the robbers. and that is true. I mean, that's what, the CIA breaking and entering in other countries sometimes to get the information that you need, or to plant a device, to bug a room. The things that you read about in spy novels and see on television really do happen. And so there's all sorts of clandestine work that gets done, but the purpose is to steal secrets. And the job of the FBI, both domestic, and the CIA is forbidden from doing that in this country, from domestic surveillance and certainly from surveilling American citizens. And the job of the FBI is to arrest criminals, and both domestically and sometimes overseas when crimes have been committed against American citizens. The FBI can travel overseas in order to arrest individuals. There are several of those cases that happen in my book, and the CIA has to work with the FBI on those operations to help pinpoint the person that they're tracking, and then to work with the FBI as the FBI moves to apprehend them. And sometimes they do operations together. Terrorists, several terrorists in the book, were had their activities short-circuited by operations in which, for example, one was lured aboard a CIA-owned yacht, I think drugged by a CIA hired psychiatrist, and then exfiltrated to stand trial for crimes, and in that case the arrest happens by the FBI, with the FBI.
So operatives had to really be personable and really go after, kind of like a journalist would you say, searching for a story. You want to get them to talk.
And you have to figure out who has the information that you want. Yes, sorry.
No. That's true. But you also said something, I was listening to another interview saying that it was a lot different, you being a journalist, that's whereas you would only have to convince your editor if you wanted to write a story.
Right.
But the CIA is so bureaucratic, they would have to convince virtually everyone in the room too.
Yeah, and those are the so you've got the fighter pilot case officers moving around the streets doing this very dangerous, difficult, risky work, gathering the intelligence, and then it all goes back to headquarters. And in addition to being filed and kept track of, this is where the analysts work, and it's their job to consider all the intelligence coming in, as well as what they call open source information, newspapers, reports that aren't classified, generated by other agencies, and to figure out what it means, and to issue predictions and warnings to the American president so that we don't have another Pearl Harbor, so that we don't have another surprise attack. So to say, here's what we think is going on in the Soviet Union. Here's what this particular leader, here's his biography, here's what we think is going on in his head. It's the difficult, and that is the job at which analysts have to get buy-in from other analysts working on other desks. And that, so it would be as if you know, I was writing a piece for The Atlantic on some aspect of national security, and every other person who wrote for The Atlantic had to agree with everything that I said.
Wow.
And so, because there was a group of younger women analysts who were tracking Al-Qaeda as early as, you know, the early years of the 1990s, and paying attention and trying to call attention to this threat that even within the building people didn't take seriously, like this sort of disconnected group of terrorists in different parts of the world who were communicating. They're like, what kind of threat could they pose? They don't have an army. They don't have a state backing them. You know, we've heard of Hezbollah and Hamas, obviously, and those were the known threats. But this kind of nameless group of fighters. So these women had to struggle within a very bureaucratic, very large institution to get people to sign off on what they felt that they were seeing.
Interesting.
So one of the takeaways, I think, is for women in intelligence work. It can be an advantage when you're moving around the street, trying to avoid surveillance, trying to avoid the KGB, that if you're in Moscow, being inconspicuous and underestimated, having them think you're nobody, you're a housewife, is good. That's a good thing. But when you're in headquarters, trying to get the attention of the CIA director or the president, trying to get people to agree with you, then it's a real hardship.
Interesting. Of course, this is the sisterhood, and I wanted to talk about how women were, if you tell us how women were recruited and what they were seen as potentially going to do for the CIA.
Yeah, so the CIA needed women. It was created in 1947 after World War II was over, and so the government, literally in newsreels, the same government that had said, "Can women come into the factories, build the bombers, build the Liberty ships, do this computer work and code breaking work," but then afterward, they literally newsreels, go home. But the CIA knew that they needed women. They believed to type all these cables and all these memos and to file them and to retrieve them when they needed them. And so women were recruited for that work in all sorts of ways. But every now and then a particularly standout candidate would be recruited for the clandestine service to do undercover work the same way that the men were. And you'll meet in the book a woman, her maiden name is Lisa Manful. She later becomes Lisa Manful Harper, recruited from Brown University in 1966 because her gifts were so unmistakable. Her fluency in many languages, including French, which she really spoke better than she spoke English because she had spent her formative years in Paris. Her experience as a diplomat's daughter, her embrace of the United States mission and America and what it stood for at a time when students on campuses in the late 60s were starting to question that and question government service. Her really belief in the sort of what America stood for, the career that her father had in the diplomatic service. So she was recruited. Brown University, like many Ivy League universities, was a fertile recruiting ground for the OSS and then for the CIA after the war. The stereotype for what they were looking for was pale, male, and Yale, which was kind of shorthand for any kind of elite background. And Lisa came from that kind of elite background. But so when they did recruit her, they promised her, and see, this is the same thing that a CIA officer might do with someone they're recruiting. Oh yeah, we'll put you in the clandestine service. Yeah, we'll give you the kind of job you want. You think you could be a good spy? Yeah, sure. We're the place for you, not the State Department. Don't take that State Department job that they've offered you. We're the place that you want to be. So they lure her in. They give her a slot at what's called the farm, this elite training facility, but they say, okay, you're in the clandestine service, but what we really want you to be is a reports officer. We want you to work at a desk. We want you to edit the cables that the men of the intelligence the men are collecting out on the street. You'll be in a foreign station. The guys will be out whining and dining the assets. You'll be at the desk. They'll come back. You can rewrite their cables because they don't really like to write. They like to get them. And then you can send it back to headquarters and you can just be handling the paper. And she was like, no. And so that is another way
Okay.
in which women were recruited, by essentially sort of dangling something that was not going to come to fruition.
Well, just because they're recruited doesn't mean they're actually really welcome, though. It just
Exactly.
doesn't seem-
Exactly.
And
That's a perfect way to put it.
there's this something systematic about the sexism involved within the company itself. And I was wondering, you go to this at length, if you could talk a little bit about what women had to endure while trying to make it as a case officer or get ahead as a case officer.
Yeah, and so you're exactly right. It was what we would today call systemic sexism or institutionalized sexism. It was, so a woman, if she stayed in her lane doing desk work or archival work, then she would get promoted up to a certain point. But not for the top jobs, not for the tippy top GS 18 jobs, not for what they called the barons, the division chiefs. And it was the kind of bureaucracy where you need a lot of people at the bottom, and then the great jobs, get smaller and smaller, very few at the top. And so they found ways to sort of shunt women into side channels that were important, but not the fighter pilots. And so the women, and you'll meet one of them who pushed back against that, had to be very tenacious and shrewd and strategic, not only in the spy work that they wanted to do and did do, but also navigating the really treacherous halls of the agency itself, and having to push back against these very powerful currents where you're working with people who are trained manipulators, who've been selected for that personality trait and trained to do it even better than they instinctively would have done. And so it becomes literally spy versus spy within the institution itself as the women push back against being channeled this way.
Speaking of institution, the institution of marriage was discouraged amongst the operatives. I would say that they were married to the agency just like nuns were married to God.
You said it better than I did. They were called brides of the agency, like the reports officers who worked in these stations overseas. What husband's going to follow a woman around the world in the 1950s or 60s? And women were explicitly told, you can't get married, you can't have children. And that's another reason I was always interested in women who served in diplomacy and intelligence during the Cold War, this conventional time, because, as I said, they really made enormous personal sacrifices in order to do this work.
Wow, they did. And on the other end, though, if an agent was married with a wife, she would be expected to participate in these.
Yeah, that was one of the great revelations to me in doing this work, is again during this period, the men were encouraged to be married. It made you, if you're in Moscow, it made you look just more normal, like you're living a normal life. The kids would be sent over to Africa or wherever you're serving, a communist country, and so your whole family would go. And this is not to say that the men had it easy. It was very stressful work, and there's a lot of alcoholism, there's a lot of substance abuse. There was at the time, there still is. It's very lonely, stressful work, but it was a stress of a different kind for the women. But just as you say, the men often had an assistant, and that was their wives. And the women were expected to help their husbands. There's all sorts of tradecraft, street tradecraft that you see in movies and on TV. The brush pass where where we would pass each other on an escalator, and I would just give you this notebook and a briefcase, or you would leave me a message beneath a park bench, and I would pick it up. And so the wives would be expected to have their big handbag, and I just spilled there are all my pens and my reading glasses, and I'll just sweep them up, and they would sweep up a message, and or drive the car to help their husband elude surveillance from the KGB, which would follow. The KGB knew who the CIA officers were in Moscow, and a lot of the CIA officers' time in Moscow, place like that, would be spent just trying to elude surveillance. And so the wife could drive the car. She could, just help in all sorts of ways. And in fact, wives serving in postings like Moscow would be trained, would receive some of the same training that their husbands did. And it's recognized, and people told me again and again, that one of the things women were particularly good at was recognizing surveillance, was spotting a disguised person who was following them, because women from such an early age are conditioned to be aware of, you know, who's on the street and just so who's in their personal space.
And they weren't even paid. So essentially this woman had 2 full-time jobs, being a housewife and being assisting the operative.
Right.
And not getting paid.
And not getting
for
paid.
either.
Yeah. Sometimes getting paid to be a secretary in the station, but at a very low level and not having any kind of an actual career. Yeah.
However, there was a lot of women that you mentioned, extensive amount of women who really rose above it, and there's a couple that stand out in my mind. First one was Eloise Page.
Yeah.
And if you maybe talk a little bit about who Eloise was and what she did.
Well, and I have a particular sort of weird affection for Eloise Page, even though all the other women hated her, and for good reason, because I'm from southwestern Virginia, and I feel like I know this sort of a person. Eloise Page was a Virginian, a very high-born Virginian. There's something in Virginia called an FFV, a First Family of Virginia. And, you know, you can trace of course, these are white families, you can trace your family back to, you know, maybe even pre-colonial times, but certainly, or you know, colonial times, pre-revolutionary times. And she came from, her name was Eloise Randolph, she always pronounced it Randolph Page, and the Randolphs and the Page were two of the oldest families, white families in Virginia. So she was an FFE 2 times over. And in that regard, she really fit in with the men of the OSS. So she too was recruited as a secretary in World War II. She actually spent a year at Hollins College, which is the same women's college that my mom later attended, not an FFE, but and so I sort of felt like I knew this kind of a person, and so she was very elitist, very snobbish, but also very shrewd and dedicated to the mission of anti-communism. She was Wild Bill Donovan's secretary during the war. Wild Bill Donovan was the director of the OSS. He was a bored Wall Street lawyer, like so many OSS officers, much more interested in doing the sort of, you know, daring exfiltration operations during the war. And he was also, as I say in the book, a sociopathic womanizer, and that is not an exaggeration. You know, these a lot of these guys just had copious affairs and liaison, and so Eloise Page learned all this stuff about him. So after the war, when she wanted to stay on at the CIA, she knew where all the bodies were buried, and she knew all the secrets, and she had all the skills and instincts and training of an operative, and so she was able to parlay what she knew into becoming, you know, one of the highest ranking women in the clandestine service, the undercover branch of the CIA. But she had to fend off constant efforts to undermine her and to thwart her and to sideline her. And so I don't want to you know, I don't want to give away spoilers, but one of my favorite operations was one that she ran in order to protect her turf against some of the guys who were trying to undermine her.
We're going to bring out a guest in just a sec, but one more person, if you can briefly touch, that I was impressed with was Cindy Storer, which we're jumping ahead several decades to Osama bin Laden and during that time. And if you could give a little teaser about who Cindy Storer was.
Yeah, and I also identified actually with Cindy's cohort of analysts who came in the late 1980s, and not just because Cindy went to William & Mary College of William & Mary, where my son also went, but because there was a cohort of women who came in the mid to late 1980s, which is the same period of time when I was entering the workforce, and so, you know, they've been to coeducational colleges. Not quite Title IX generation yet, but a much more equal academic playing field, graduated thinking, okay, you know, this is great, and the job has been done, we're equal, I made great grades, the CIA wants to hire me, and then they get into the workplace, and they find that they are not welcome, and that it's a very different world from the university where they make good grades and great grades and stuff. And in fact, Cindy's first day as what they call an imagery analyst, looking at aerial images that taken by spy planes, like the U-2 spy plane. She's going to be trained to really study these images to see if North Korea is violating, a treaty. All these treaties that say the Reagan administration is striking to prevent nuclear proliferation have to be verified. So the trust but verify. So she was one of the verifiers. But her very first day, the older veteran guy who's going to be her mentor, the first thing he does to her is he opens a desk drawer and shows her his Swedish porn. He has porn in his drawer, and she knows that it's a test, and she's just like, okay, but that's the sort of thing that they had to, the gauntlet that they had to run, that generation of women really wasn't prepared for, but she persisted and she became very good at imagery analysis. And then Cindy was one of the first at the CIA as an analyst looking at Afghanistan. She came on that desk in '89, which is when the Soviet occupiers were pushed out of Afghanistan, and then 2 years later the Soviet Union itself would collapse. And Cindy noticed that these fighters who had traveled to Afghanistan to repel the Soviet infidel, they weren't going home. They weren't going back to their home countries. They were fanning out, and they were starting to form this network. And just as she had been trained to study shadowy shapes and images, she began tracking them and creating visuals to show that it was a network, and it was what we would ultimately know as Al-Qaeda. Mm-hmm. And it is really, I think, hard for us today to know that there was a period of time when people didn't know what the name was of this group of terrorists. They didn't know who had a relationship with who was really a member of the organization. Was it an organization? It was Cindy who had literally an epiphany moment where she was looking at all these onboarding documents. I mean, actually, like financial statements. She said, they were accounting for desk chairs. She said, this is a bureaucracy. Like, this is an organization. They're hiring people. They have some freelancers. And so she's one of the ones who began, trying to sound the alarms very early on.
Thank goodness she did. I'd like to bring out a very special guest that some of you know. She's been in the company she was with the company for 35 years. First as a reports officer, a clerk, and then she rose up to not only be a station chief, but to head up counterterrorism in the Middle East, I believe. So please welcome Heidi August.
You can correct everything that I said now. Heidi, I have to say, Heidi was one of the intrepid women who not only spent her career that she'll talk about, but who agreed to talk to me. And she did not see the book before it was published. None of the women in the book were able to see it before it was published or have any sort of creative control over it. So she trusted me, the way that so many people have trusted her over the years. And it's always a great relief to an author. I had a friend at the Washington Post, a colleague, and whenever he was talking to someone about whether they would agree to be profiled, like an in-depth profile, he would say to them, I understand that this is my job, this is my work, this is your life, and I understand that. And so I go into interviews understanding that this is somebody's life and that they're trusting me with this, and I'm just glad that you're still speaking to me. I mean, it seems like you're still speaking to me. And so I enjoyed so many interviews during the pandemic. We had distanced outdoor interviews. Ultimately, we were able to come inside, come here, go next door. So Heidi, maybe you could talk about how you were recruited, your recruitment story, and what your motivation was to do this work.
Okay. Actually, I was not recruited. I had to recruit them. Mm-hmm. I started to get interested in the agency when I was about 12 years old. I had read an article in Newsweek magazine, and I decided this is something I'd like to do. I was watching, shows on television, primarily about the FBI, but that was okay. I wrote a letter on my dad's office typewriter to the CIA, telling them I had read this article and I was really interested in future employment, although I'd only been, I was only 12 years old. I knew I had a while to wait, and what should I do to prepare for this? So about a month later, when I just addressed it, Central Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C., we didn't have any zip code. This was 1958, 59. So I wrote this letter, and about 6 weeks later, I got a letter back. And it was kind of thick, and I opened it up, and it was a pamphlet, and it was entitled Secretarial Careers in CIA. So, when you're 12 years old, that's fine with me, just the idea was to get your foot in the door. So then later at the University of Colorado, just before I graduated, there was an employment fair. All these government agencies were there, and sure enough, there was a CIA table there. And I had never lost this thought about doing this. So I went up to the table and I said, I've been wanting to work for you for a long time. I wrote you a letter when I was 12 years old, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, what are you interested in doing? And I said, well, the pamphlet said that, you hire secretaries and clerks. And I said, I'm interested. And he reached down and he pulled up that same pamphlet. Same one. He didn't change it. So anyway, I then went to work for the San Francisco Hilton. And I did apply. It took about a year and a half. They do extensive background checks. And so I was hired as a GS3 clerk. I didn't even make it to secretarial because I didn't take shorthand. I didn't care. I just wanted to get my foot in the door. So I went, at age, whatever it was, 21, and I was put in this sort of large, kind of like a secretarial pool, and the first thing that we had to do was they taught us how to fold maps. Okay? And they're maps that were of all worldwide cities. Anyway, so I did that for a few weeks, and then finally went up to the headquarters building. We were down in Roslyn, Virginia, and I was put in Africa Division. And I said, oh, but I told them I was really interested in Europe. The lady said, get in line. Everybody wanted to go to either Rome, Paris, London. So I said, that's fine. And they had a job for me as a clerk in our office in Tripoli, Libya. And I had to go to the map to find out where it was. So I went there. We had an office on a U.S. air base outside of Tripoli. And the embassy in Tripoli, that's where the station was, the station chief. And we were the operational base just outside of town. Because we had all the sensitive files, because they always thought that the embassy would be more vulnerable to attacks. So I showed up there in 1969, and I think it was the second week I was there, I had a friend come and visit me from Tunisia. She flew over, and we went. It was a holiday weekend. It was Labor Day. And so we went with a friend of mine, a guy who was a school teacher there at the American School in Tripoli, and we were down in Ghadames, down way in the desert, and we got involved in a rather serious car accident. And I was driving the office car. We rolled down. Anyway, we ended up at the hospital. We were okay. And that night we had a bottle of wine, and the next morning at about 6 o'clock, Joni knocked on my door. She was in the guest room and said, what are the fireworks for? And I said, what fireworks? And she said, I think it's gunfire. I said, well, just a minute. So I went out to the living room and I opened up the French doors, and sure enough, there were Libyan soldiers going in and taking over the national radio station. And it was the Gaddafi coup.
Wow.
Nobody had ever heard of this person, ever. We had nothing in our files about it, nothing. This was a rather huge intelligence gap. I mean, it was very serious. And the chief of station was basically blamed for it, and he had a nervous breakdown, and they had to medevac him out of there. But it taught me a very valuable lesson, that if you get caught up in something like that and you're head of the office, you're the one who takes the blame. It was a huge intelligence failure for what happened afterwards with Gaddafi. So let's fast forward. Well, first of all, we had 12 U.S. government safes, 4 drawers each, packed with very, very sensitive files. That's not my dog. And we had to destroy all of this stuff. And the only thing we had in our warehouse was a sodium nitrate drum that you're supposed to put all the classified material in and then light a match and back away. Anyway, so Joni and I are there by ourselves doing this, and because nobody in the office had a telephone. There were myself, and we had an administrative officer, the chief of the office, and then 2 other case officers. But it was a day off. It was Labor Day. So Joni and I got rid of this stuff, and we had taken a course together in emergency burn of the office. And we're sort of looking at each other like, do you remember what that thing said? You know. So, and the Libyan Air Force shared the base, and so they were flying over the base, and they were flying over the city and coming back, and they could see all this, what was going on with this fires. Anyway, we got rid of everything, and then it was like, okay, well, to me, you know, what do you do now? And I said, well, anyway, we stayed there until Gaddafi threw us off of the base because he wanted it all to himself. We got rid of all the Americans. So then I ended up in Europe. I ended up in Germany. And from there, I was in Bonn with the old American embassy there as a secretary. The only thing really nice about it was that my office window overlooked the Rhine River. So I see all these boats going up and down the Rhine. And I was finally in Europe, and I thought, gee, you know, Europe is what I always wanted. And it turned out, after several other tours in Europe, that it's probably the most boring. It really is. I mean, once your first assignment is, you know, you're in the middle of a coup. How do you top this?
Well, some people might have been dissuaded by that. I mean, then maybe that's
No, it really whet my appetite.
Exactly.
So, anyway, over the years, I then went to in Germany, then I went up to Finland, and I met a very, very interesting character who was the boss, David Whipple, whose picture is in the book. And David kind of took me under his wing, and he said, well, I'm going to teach you what I know. And he said, we have too many agents here at the station in Helsinki, and I need another case officer, and bingo, you're it. And I said, fine. He said, I'll train you. So that's how I learned, was on the streets of Helsinki, even in the wintertime. And from there then, he said, look, he said, I'm going to Cambodia as the next chief of station. This is the war was starting in Cambodia, and he said, I would like you to come with me. And I said, you sure Mrs. Whipple knows about this? And he said, yes. Because it was an unaccompanied tour. So I went with David to Cambodia, and we were there about a year and a half. I was his secretary, but he had me doing all kinds of stuff, to include, when it got down to the very end, his most senior agent that he had in the Cambodian government was a very important guy on their National Security Council, and he came to David at the end when things were getting really bad with the Khmer Rouge coming into town. We had to get all of our local employees out of there. And David said, I want you to take this fellow's family and take them out to the airport where the support flights are coming in with, they were bringing in, I don't know, fuel and food and whatever. And I did that, and it ended up being a wild ride because we had to go run across runways, and the children were all frightened. And anyway, I put them on the flight and got them out. And David wrote up a very nice sort of a commendation for this, and he said, this woman is meant to be a case officer. And so I then went back for the training at Camp Perry, which is in Virginia, outside of Richmond, where I had the training for 4 months. And there were 2 women in the class, and there were 21 men. And the 2 of us came out at the top of the class. So then I end up, David said, look, I'm gonna go out and be the chief of station in Geneva, and I think you would really enjoy it. There's lots to do there and whatever. He said, and you're gonna be a case officer because you've been through the training and you were officially anointed as a case officer. So I went to Geneva, and it was in Geneva that I decided that we didn't have any female actual agents. All the agent files I had read for 10 years were all men.
Agent's another word for asset, right?
Yes,
The
an
people
asset,
who-
yeah, the real spies. We didn't have any women. They were all men, and I thought, you know, this is crazy. I was sitting in Geneva at the European headquarters of the United Nations, and I'm sitting there at the US desk with the placard in front of me, and I'm looking around, and I see all of these women in the room in very important positions, and they're from every country that, you know, you could imagine. All the UN people were there. And a lot of the women were what we call hard targets, who come from countries where we didn't have much coverage, like, you know, Cuba, Ethiopia, those kinds of things. And I saw a bunch of women, and I thought, gee, this is really interesting. I'm gonna try to maybe find a case that I can work on, and I did. Actually, I found 3 of them. And it started, what I found was that the women make much, much better agents. They're much more detail-oriented, they're much more observant. You know, the guys are sort of all over the place. They can't remember anything, but the women, boy, they're really sharp. And there was a gal there in Geneva who had access to something that we had never had access to, ever. And we worked very well together, and we made it happen. And it got quite a bit of attention back in Washington. And then Bill Casey came to town. Bill Casey was a former director, the late director. He was a director at the time, and he used to travel a lot. He would come to the station and talk to people. And he asked that they arrange a meeting of the 2 of us. And it was the first time I had ever met alone with the director. Bill Casey's problem was that he mumbled. I mean, he really mumbled. And it was really hard to understand. Did he say, you know, germinate or terminate? I mean, they don't know the difference. So he said to me, where are you going next? This was after my 3 years in Geneva. And I said, well, I've applied to go to Kinshasa, Zaire, because I want to work for the chief of station down there, who was a rather famous guy, and I would really appreciate the opportunity. And he said, well, I'm going to think about that. And then he left and went on the rest of his trip. And about 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in the UN, and one of the officers from the station comes down and says, hey, the boss wants to see you now. So I dropped what I was doing. I went up the hill to the US mission, and David hands me a cable from Washington, and it's Eyes Only Me from Bill Casey. And he said, I'm hereby appointing you the next chief of station in Malta, where we have never had a station. Malta is a little teeny tiny island in between Sicily and North Africa. And he said, you know, we know that, you know, you may feel, I forget how he put it, you may not feel prepared or something. He said, but don't worry, we'll get you all trained and everything will be fine. So I went to David and I said, you know, I don't think I can do this. I really didn't think. I had never worked with the liaison services. I really didn't have that much experience. I'd had one assignment in Geneva as a case officer, and here I'm going to be a chief of a brand new station. Most of the stations were established right after World War II in the late 40s, almost all of them. And so they all had, you know, long histories and built-in agents and everything else. And this was starting from scratch. And so he said, well, David said, well, go home and think about it and then answer the cable tomorrow morning. Don't do anything. So I thought about it. I said, no, I'm going to tell him I'm very, very flattered, but I really don't feel that I have enough experience to handle a job like this.
Mm-hmm.
And he read it and he said, you sure you're going to want to send this? And I said, yeah, let's go ahead. So it took about 4 hours for that message to get to Washington. And I get back one from Bill Casey saying, you are hereby directed to go open up the Malta station. So I did that, and it was a very successful assignment. I was there for 3 years. I took my secretary with me, who had been a friend, and she said, I go anywhere where you go. And then we got another case officer, and we really made something of this station. Ended up with quite a few agents. And the big target for us were the Libyans. You all remember that?
Your old friend.
That, if you remember that plane crash, Pan Am 103, that took off. It ended up over Lockerbie, Scotland, but it blew up after it took off from Heathrow. The bomb for that was put on into the system from Malta by the Libyan intelligence service there. It was not meant to go off over Scotland, it was meant to go off over the Atlantic Ocean. But we actually managed to take all the pieces from this 747, and they brought it back, all the pieces, and they put it back together. And they found the actual suitcase that had carried the bomb, and in there they found there were some new shirts, men's shirts, that had been made in Malta and purchased from a Maltese store. And that's kind of where the hunt began for, okay, asking the owner, do you remember who bought, these shirts, and can you identify whatever, and that ended up, they eventually did get their hands on him. So in Malta then, we also had a very interesting event that I'll never ever get over. Was having dinner one night with some friends down on the seafront, and the maitre d' of the restaurant came over and he said, excuse me, he said, are you with the American Embassy? And I said, yes. He said, well, you have a phone call. Now, we weren't carrying pagers or anything. We didn't have any of that stuff. You had to let people know where you were going to be so you could be reached in an emergency. And I went, and it was the ambassador on the phone. And he said, look, he said, we have, there's an Egyptian airliner that has been hijacked out of Athens on its way to Cairo. There are Americans on board, all kinds of Europeans, quite a few Palestinians, and he said, you have to join me out here at the airport. So I said, fine. So I tore out of there and went home, and I changed into jeans and went out to the airport, and I had never had any kind of training for anything like this. We didn't have any, there was no entity in the U.S. government to handle hijackings at that time. This was right after the Achille Lauro incident, if you remember that. And so, I mean, and it's on a weekend, of course, when everything happens. And so I'm just operating out of my back pocket. And we had no secure communications with anybody, no secure phones. So at the airport, at the control tower, they said, okay, we're gonna have a room here for the diplomatic corps that you can use as your sort of like command post. There were 3 Americans and a couple of Israelis on the plane, and I sort of at that point thought, well, okay, well, the Israelis, we're gonna have to look out for them. They didn't have an embassy in Malta. So I got stuck in this room with the Libyan ambassador and the PLO representative, just the 3 of us. And we shared one phone in the middle of our table. And of course, they're all, they're calling all kinds of people, and it's all in Arabic. And I called my office, because I had them all come in to work. And the only way I could communicate with them was to use Big Latin. Figuring these guys will never figure this out, and they didn't. And it was a long 27 hours. Before September 11th, it was the bloodiest hijacking ever. The Egyptians came in to try to save these people. the Americans offered, but we were turned down. Malta they considered themselves neutral. So to have, the Americans come in was just, they had once had a NATO base there, and they threw that out, so they took their neutrality very seriously, although they were much more pro-Libyan than anything else. There was a group of Americans at the embassy in Cairo, in the attaché's office, and they actually came along with the Egyptian team that was supposed to storm the plane. And I had told them ahead of time, do not come in your uniforms, because they would not allow anybody with a foreign military uniform to land on the island. So I had to go out to the plane when it landed to tell these guys, you're gonna have to sit in the plane. That's it. Egyptians showed up, and you could see the amount of C4, they were bringing explosives. Long story short, they basically sort of almost killed everybody on the plane. When they attacked it, they used an explosive to get into the luggage hatch in the back, and instead of using, a quarter of something, they used 5 1/4 of it. They thought more is better, and it absolutely just sent a fireball down this entire fuselage. I had also seen earlier in the day an American woman who was actually murdered at the top of the stairs. She was very tall, Scarlett Rogenkamp. She was about 6 feet tall. And they made her, because the guy couldn't reach the top of her head because he was so short, she had to get down on her knees. And I could see this. I had binoculars, and I was looking out of a window in the bathroom of the control tower. And it was like watching a movie. Shot within, she was dead before she hit the tarmac. I then had the very unpleasant duty of calling her mother. I was also the consular officer there at that embassy. I was in charge of basically all the visas that were issued to people, American citizens who were in trouble. It all falls into something called the consular section, and that was my cover in Malta. It was a real job. I literally had 2 jobs, and I really only got paid for one. But that was okay. It was a good excuse to have a good cover, because you could be anywhere on this island, because everybody knew you were the visa lady. Which turned out to be an interesting thing. Anyway, so let me get over this. But anyway, so that was that. And we had no way, the US government did not have any kind of a counterterrorism capability. We had nothing. The military had a couple of guys, but this was far and above, way above their skill level. So we basically just made this up. Not made it up, but we did the best we could do with what we had available. Washington was of little to no help. Because there was no counterterrorism center, there were no counterterrorism experts, no one knew anything about this Abu Nidal group that had hijacked this thing. We were totally blind. And this was 1985. And it was at that point, particularly when I had to go to the hospital to identify Scarlett Rogenkamp's body as the consular officer, that I said to this dead person, I said, look, that could be me where you are right now. We were the same government grade. She was from California. We were about the same age. And that easily could have been me. She was going to Cairo for Thanksgiving. This was the weekend before Thanksgiving. So I said, I'm going to make this my career. Because nobody was doing counterterrorism in 1985. Nobody. So that's what I did, and I made a whole career out of it. I won't bore you, we can read it in the book, but I ended up being the chief of operations of the Counterterrorist Center. And we were then, at Cindy's store, we were all hunting for bin Laden. And then things just kind of went up from there.
So, we've talked so many times, and every time we talk, I have more questions. But I know that everybody has been listening with rapt interest to your incredible story. I really do have like a bunch of questions I could ask now. But let's open it up to
Anybody have any
questions from a very
questions?
engaged audience.
Does anybody have any questions for Heidi or Liza?
I have a question for Heidi.
Yeah.
Heidi, you knew this at age 12, which is amazing.
I knew at age 12.
So now, 34 years later, however many years later, you're there, and you're thinking, is this what you thought it was going to be?
No, I had no idea. I didn't think I'd ever retire. I loved my job. Couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. I was never bored. No 2 days were ever alike.
But you said as a child that you always thought it would be thrilling to be in the spot where history was being
Yes,
made.
yes.
Because of your uncle
I
who
had
was
aunt
in the
and uncle
casino.
who were in the casino in Havana when Castro's troops took over that night. My uncle's sitting there with a big pile of chips that he couldn't cash in. And I thought that was really neat because they could actually witness history. And that was kind of my whole series of my career.
Your life
was
unfolded.
witnessing history. It
Yeah.
was one of those sort of Forrest Gump type stories where wherever I was, something amazing happened. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
So this is for you, Liza. Today, do the women of the CIA have the same challenges that you were speaking of? Would you say there are more opportunities? Either one of you.
No, I think in the Directorate of Operations, I think the top 4 jobs are all occupied by women.
Or
Exactly
were
that
under
is-
Gina Haspel. I don't know who they are now.
So you've made progress?
I don't know, but, and then Gina became the director, but a bunch of us decided at about, I guess we were GS-15s at the time, that we needed to bring up this next generation. And so a really good friend of mine, adopted Gina, sort of as her,
Gina Haspel.
who became the director, and we made sure that these women were given jobs, important jobs. We made a list of what we call the nifty 50 jobs in the agency. We did a study of how many of them had been occupied by women. It was virtually 0.
So you all began to build a sisterhood.
Cadre, yeah.
But just from as an outside observer, in terms of the challenges, I interviewed some a case officer she's probably 30 now, so a younger generation, and it seemed to me that some of the challenges do remain the same. You're out here in lonely outposts. It's very stressful work. A lot of it is on you as an individual, and I learned. When Molly Chambers was describing to me just some of the basic things she had to do when she got to a new city, I always wondered those maps that you all were folding, like, what did they do with those maps? And she showed me this map of Kampala that she was her first assignment, and all these X's and all these little triangles and everything, and I realized she explained to me she had to memorize, and I'm sure you did too, the whole map of the whole city. The way that taxi drivers in London used to have to know every street, every bar, every place, no-go zone, go zone. I mean, places where so that when they're surveilling, so that you can escape, and that sort of challenge doesn't go away for the work.
That's true.
Because it's
That's
still
true, yeah.
it's still very hard.
I spent 3 years, the West Bank was my territory. From 88 to 91, I was in Jerusalem, and there are no maps of those West Bank cities.
Wow.
And it was downright dangerous because the rocks kept getting thrown at us. Yes, sir.
Sort of for both of you, the description that you gave of management and its ability to vet unconventional and possibly valuable ideas sounds like a pretty poor management system. And I've kind of looked at, management systems at automotive companies as well as in software companies, and oddly enough, even in education bureaucracies. And based upon the reviews that I've done over the decades, it sounds like it's not a good place for innovation, or at least it wasn't at the time frame
That's
that
right.
you were
You're
describing.
right.
And what I'm just trying to get at, I'm almost just looking for comments. Do you believe, number one, that my understanding of it is correct? And if so, do you believe that there are any structures that are in there that have to be there? And obviously, there's a tremendous amount of secrecy, and that's a stricture that, Ford Motor Company doesn't have that, for example. But are there any things that you think are unique that probably should be fixed for the percolation of a good idea? Or is that just kind of the way it has to be?
No, everything was very individualized. It was like I had the idea of, why aren't we recruiting women?
And
That
that
was
flew.
true of a case officer in the field, but not so much for the analysts back at headquarters, would you say?
I can't speak because I never really had a lot of experience in headquarters, but,
Because you didn't like
Yeah.
headquarters.
no,
It was endless meetings.
I did my best to stay out of there.
Mm.
Although if you wanted to get promoted, you really had to go home at a certain point. I didn't really find that. I just found that the more senior you got, the more you were listened to.
I mean, that makes sense.
Unlike the military, when you look at somebody's badge, you have no idea what their rank is, whereas the military, all you have to do is look at their shoulders.
Right.
And so they had no idea, but I found though that as I got more senior, that I had a lot more clout.
People describe the CIA, particularly when Heidi was serving, as being almost two different institutions in that the clandestine service officers in the field, I think it's fair to say you were innovating all the time, whereas the analysts back at headquarters, whose job it is to write the reports for the president, that's where the bottleneck was.
Okay, so that
the
it
insights weren't traveling
literally
up.
directorates
Yeah.
like DDI.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it is my impression, just based on the interviews I conducted, that by the time, say, the hunt for bin Laden
Right.
was taking place, that lower level analysts were listened to. By lower level, I mean the ground level analysts who were targeting these guys. They were brought into the meetings and trusted their observations and their insights about whether he was in the compound, what floor of the compound he was on. They were trusted in a way that they hadn't been before.
What I'm interested in is whether you think that there was any cultural norms in the pale Yale and male culture that maybe aged out by that time.
They eventually did, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but that may have been a cultural norm.
Once the Barons started retiring, things changed.
Liza Mundy, thank you very much. Heidi August, thank you for joining us. The
You see why this is
sisterhood.
our-